There are so many indications that one doesn't know what one sees.
Dear BATF and all other citizens of the United States, I've put together a few thought exercises in regards to the proposed ATF Rule 2021-R-08. Not all ideas are rational, even though on the surface they may seem very persuasive if one applies such tactics like using representative heuristics, for example. To expose any logical fallacies being used to regulate the Second Amendment, I'll start with thought exercise number 1. In this unrealistic example, I'm going to demonstrate a non-rational, nonsensical position. If I said, in order to stop gun violence, I'm going to climb a tree, this should sound pretty ridiculous because it is. In this example, climbing the tree is not only unrelated, but it wouldn't affect the outcome of creating more or less gun violence. Starting with a new sentence, I might say, in order to stop gun violence, I'm going to ban stabilizing braces. In this case, banning the stabilizing brace also does not affect gun violence. If we simply remove the brace, we still have the gun and violence. A criminal person could still carry out gun violence whether they shoot a projectile or simply use the weapon to attack another person physically. The only thing here we have accomplished is banning a stabilizing brace. Starting over, we could this time ban the gun itself, leaving only the brace and violence. Since violence is a behavior, one could easily take the brace and start harming or injuring others by simply attacking them with it, possibly resulting in death with the right impacts. We would call this brace violence. Starting over once again, we would simply remove violence since it seems to be the behavior causing the problems. Oddly enough, without violence, we are left with just the stabilizing brace and the gun, in which they would just simply exist. These inanimate objects cannot commit violence by themselves since they are not living autonomous beings. It turns out that with the behavior of violence combined with criminal intent, the inanimate object is not the problem. If we exchange out the braced gun for a knife and call it knife violence, banning the knife still leaves us with violence. A malicious individual could easily use a vehicle in place of the knife and call it vehicle violence. Here again, the vehicle is not the causation of the violence. I also find it interesting that in a domestic violence situation, the house is not considered the causation of the violence. It is just the location selected where the violence occurred. If this same violence were to move into a public space off of the private property, it just becomes an assault. Clearly, we all agree that the uninvolved public cannot be blamed for the violence, so we just chalk it up as an assault. The public space was not the causation for the violence any more than the house was in the domestic case. It is always the individual with intent to commit violence. It turns out in all of these examples, the individual was the causation of the violence and not any location or object can be blamed. It was always violence. This behavior function is what turns an object into a tool for harm. This is the truth behind the curtain. Now, why would our authorities not just ban violence? Well, it's because they cannot. They can only carry out punishment as an aftermath. Just like any other thing they have made illegal, including heroin, rape, or even murder, they cannot stop it preemptively. Any object can be used to commit violence, including our physical arms and hands, which they cannot ban. This lack of control exposes the surface facade they carry about having the power to fix violence. Even they use violence to combat violence. Like the common example used in pop culture, when a police officer is charged with an unjustified murder, the government is quick to blame the individual and not the agency, department, or the weapon. They might even say that individual actions do not represent the ethics of the rest of them, which is the same thing the public is saying. If the public does the same exact thing, it is blamed on the access to the weapon. Now, this causes a self-contradiction fallacy, and a contradiction is a logical error of the mind. If the individual is blamed in the police case, then the individual should also be blamed in the public case. If the public case is caused by weapon access, then the police case should also be blamed on the weapon access. Whether it's the ATF killing innocent civilians like they have in the past, or even our own military killing innocent civilians, then we should ban the access from our government entities having any access to weapons. We know they're using fallacious arguments, and so do they. We'll get to why this is happening later, but for now, let's move to thought exercise number 2. If I put this stabilizing brace onto my 16-inch rifle, which is legal, did it change the lethality of the weapon or create criminal intent? The answer is no. The weapon remains almost identically as capable as it was before the change, with the exception of a cosmetic change. This means once again the brace had no enhancement to lethality or creation of intent. Causation blame cannot be passed on to the brace. There is no peer-reviewed study showing efficacy within an acceptable p-value proving that a brace increases lethality and, most importantly, increases or creates criminal intent. The burden of proof is on the accuser of this idea and not the law-abiding citizen. To further point out the erroneous logic behind the kinds of thoughts that go into these regulations, I'll animate the smoking gun argument. If I were to legally file proper paperwork and meet the BATF requirements to legally turn a pistol-braced firearm into a short-barreled rifle without changing a single functioning feature, including the brace, this is approved. It would be the same identical weapon configuration as before, with the only difference being a $200 tax stamp process. This shows the brace was never the concern. It was a $200 tax stamp. The BATF approves of this, and it makes you wonder why they assert that this is about safety. If criminal intent is present, a person or agent could use this exact same weapon to do unlawful harm as long as they pay the tax stamp fee. This exposes that the length, weight, and brace was not the issue since the short barrel rifle configuration is approved. This is a major contradiction. So what then is the obsession with banning the stabilizing brace? With a self-proclaimed estimate from the brace manufacturers of 20 million braces in circulation at $200 each, the BATF stands to generate $4.1 billion in revenue for short barrel rifle submissions for law-abiding owners to keep their current pistol configurations lawfully. Since this could be considered a possible conflict of interest, I would encourage the citizens of the United States to follow these instructions in the event that this proposed bill succeeds in banning the stabilizing brace. Remove the brace from the weapon and reinstall a rifle-length barrel of 16 inches or more into the weapon. This would prevent the large sum of money being sent to the BATF, thus legally stopping any conflict of interest incentives that may have influence on these types of regulations. This would reallocate this possible $4.1 billion plus right back to our beloved barrel manufacturers. I understand that the stubborn part of us does not instantly like this, but it is the intellectual move to legally both keep our weapon and refuse to allow any entrapment, ultimatum-like motives used by the BATF to increase revenue. Everything we do in this world is decided on an incentive and consequence basis. Here we can simply eliminate any incentive for the BATF to gain any type of revenue by converting our pistol brace weapons into short barrel rifles. Before we wrap this up, let's go over one last thought exercise. Now that we're talking about contradictions, let's make up one last erroneous illogical sentence. I was physically in the United States and also China at the exact same time on the exact same day in the exact same minute. Well, since this is a contradiction, it's also deceptive. I cannot exist in these two places physically at once. I was either at one or the other, or possibly even another location that I didn't mention. I bring this up because if the concern of the BATF is to eliminate dangerous weapons and their configurations, thus stopping gun violence, they would target pistols, which accounts for the majority of firearm deaths. If this appeal to our emotions were truly about stopping the most deaths as fast as possible, this would be the targeted configuration, a simple handgun. This contradiction allows us to eliminate that the open dialogue from the BATF asserting they want to stop gun violence cannot be supported by a stabilizing brace ban. It turns out that since a handgun is not regulated under the NFA rules, it cannot be subject to a $200 tax stamp fee to retain ownership. It's almost like regulating the number one weapon used to cause firearm deaths won't make them any money through regulation unless it was added to the National Firearms Act. This sounds a lot like a certain somebody wanting to completely add all Armalite rifles to this list so that it can also be restricted to be owned without paying the $200 tax stamp fee.
Would you support banning the AR as the AR rifle platform and telling people they have to turn it in?
What I support is treating them just like machine guns.
With respect to the AR-15, I support a ban as has been presented in a Senate bill and supported by the President.
So that's a yes, right? I mean, you have to get a very special and hard to get federal license for machine guns.
The government does not.
Very few people have machine guns.
Well, right now, millions of firearms registered under the National Firearms Act have been lawfully owned by Americans since the 1930s. To me, if you want to have a weapon of war, the same gun that was issued me as a member of ATF SWAT team, it makes sense that you would have to pass a background check, the gun would have to be in your name, and there would be a picture and fingerprints on file. Like, to me, I don't mind doing that if I want to buy a gun. These policies just protect the criminal. Like, I don't think you should be able to anonymously purchase 20 AR-15s at one time and the government shouldn't know.
So the AR is the most popular semi-automatic
It is.
rifle in the country.
Yes.
So the people that have ARs would have to get government permission to continue to own it and or give it in?
The same government permission, which is a background check. I mean, I think when you say government permission, we have to be clear what that is. The same permission I guess I have to go through when I buy a gun, which is just prove you're not a criminal. So yeah, if that's what you're calling permission, I don't think it's unreasonable at all that you have to pass a background check to own a weapon.
And to get a
of war.
fully automatic, it's you have to pay a big fee. And then to go through a federal background check
it's
to get the
$200.
FFL. What is it?
It's the same fee that was charged in 1930. I mean, a typical concealed carry permit today costs that much. It cost me $150.
So what would happen in DC if I said I want to go get an M60? I really think they're interesting, and I want to go fire one. You think I'd be able to do it?
I think that like, I don't know what DC's law is. That's a good question.
The answer is no. But
Okay.
yeah.
With millions and millions of Armalite rifles in the United States, this would be billions of dollars in revenue. It's almost like a pattern is forming here. In the proposed ATF Rule 2021R-08, they mentioned that 2 unlawful shootings were carried out by a braced weapon, as if the brace was the cause. This is a good time to mention that correlation is not causation fallacy. In this chart, we can easily see how people were tricked into thinking that similar timed increases can make it appear that we know what the cause was and the effect. This trick is used over and over to deceive people, even in their everyday life. Here it looks like the divorce rate in Maine is either causing the margarine consumption rate to decline, or divorce decline is caused by less margarine consumption. This correlation does not mean causation. This is a well-known fallacy. The divorce itself may actually be due to a change in legislation taking away incentives to divorce, completely unrelated to why margarine is being consumed less. In this picture here, we can see that melting ice cream and sunburns correlate, but one is not the causation of the other. Here, the sun is the culprit responsible for the 2 correlating events. In the case where the ATF selectively mentions that 2 braced firearms were used in a shooting might trick you into believing that this correlates to causation, which is a dishonest trick. They have no way to prove that the event would not have occurred even if the brace wasn't present. If more guns are sold and gun violence increases, they're quick to blame the gun ownership. But a lot of things may correlate with a hidden causation, like, I don't know, intent to use unlawful violence maybe? House prices have increased, milk costs have increased, human populations have increased. Does this then mean that any increase like brace ownership that correlates is the cause? Of course not. What has increased is the cultural intent to commit gun violence. After the COVID lockdowns, guns and Armalite rifle ownership skyrocketed, yet the Armalite nor gun deaths reflect the increase in firearm sales. If we just ask who, what, where, when, why surrounding a gun crime, we're using the age-old scientific method. One might actually find the cause if they simply asked. Who, a made-up person named Karen, shot another woman in her home last night because she caught her sleeping with her husband. Why is the intent? If we remove the gun and replace it with a knife, Karen stabbed a person in her house last night because she caught her sleeping with her husband. Again, intent to commit violence is the causation, not an increase in a new trendy kitchen knife. Even if we study the why, intent, this is complex. It could be a buildup of events in her life, like past betrayals from her husband, combined with anger issues, an upbringing of violence to solve problems learned by her family's interactions, combined with the feeling of helplessness that this is the 3rd time her husband has cheated, combined with her made-up justification that the woman deserved to be stabbed. Even as I was editing this video today, there was a mass stabbing in Germany in which 3 people died and 6 more were injured. Ironically, the authorities came with Armalite rifles and an MP5 to shoot the criminal murderer. Funny how this works, right? Even when mass shooters have been interviewed and asked why, which is their reasoning or cause of intent, it has nothing to do with access to firearms. Here, even the mass shooter admits that gun restrictions will not help, and he said evil will always exist, and a good citizen who is armed is what is needed to stop people like him. Getting the why, or intent, directly from the mind of the criminal tells us that it's not any kind of these fallacious, deceptive arguments made to regulate or ban firearms. Back to the braced, it most likely has to do with popularity by coincidence and cannot be claimed with 100% certainty that the brace caused the intent to form and the crime to be committed. This is artificial justification based off of speculation at best. This isn't how logic or science works. Wrapping this up, I'm going to say a few things. First off, I want to declare that I'm aware that not all agents working under the authority of the ATF have ill intentions towards you, the citizen, or the Second Amendment. All subgroups can have a bad apple, and we cannot let that one lead us into a hasty generalization fallacy. Just because one police officer is bad doesn't make them all bad. If a civilian commits a firearm crime, we can't say that all civilians will commit a firearm crime. Now, to understand logically why all of this happening, it has to do with money. All government budgets come from one place: taxation. Last time I checked, the federal government had a budget of $4.5 trillion. Out of this budget, agencies like the ATF, FBI, DEA, CIA receive all of their funding. With the BATF having 5,000 field agents, let's pretend they get hired in at $30,000 a year. As they advance and a pay raise is due, the money has to come from somewhere. Eventually they retire, let's say making $60,000 a year, and a new agent replaces them at an entry-level $30,000 a year. We get one agent at the price of two at $90,000. When this new agent retires and another one replaces them at $30K, we're now up to $60K plus $60K plus $30K for a grand total of $150,000, giving us one for the price of three. Since all government money comes from taxation, I'm sure you guessed how they fund this. This process requires a never-ending increase in budget to fund this kind of growth. Unlike the private sector, where we have to earn our money through a process of free will, the government can simply increase their profit through the swift movement of a pen. Like a virus, the government feeds off of money consumption to function. As it multiplies, it needs more and more money to the point it will get desperate to find its income so it can grow. This eventually leads to a self-destructing end. A good antiviral prescription for this is to educate ourselves against heuristics and fallacious arguments. To remain relevant and save their careers, they will use whatever tactics needed to secure their pensions and payroll. As far as the serializing of parts and upper receivers that is also being proposed, just apply this video and it'll make sense that it's about money. We know that serializing, once again, does not stop gun violence. A criminal mind will just remove the new quantity of serial numbers since they don't respect the rule of law anyway. And dear ATF, please stop with these rules and focus on the decay of responsible culture. Find out what conditions are being created to form criminal intent and stop generalizing law-abiding citizens. The right to self-defense by any means necessary is not granted by mere humans, but by our own autonomy gifted to us at birth by something much higher than any agency or person. Turning us into criminals to remain relevant does not improve the quality of American life. Thanks for watching, and let's cross our fingers that our elected officials stop attempting to destroy our Bill of Rights.